Hi there, this is Alvin from Dr. Wealth. Today I'm going to talk about this concept called Moats, M-O-A-T-S. And you might have heard of this term before because it is a borrowed term from Warren Buffett, and he did mention that when you invest in a company, you need to look for a company that has this economic moats. Okay, so what is this moat? Historically, it belongs to the castle era, where this moat is like a water body that surrounds a castle, and they might throw in some alligators, I don't know, or what kind of predatory animals in it. The purpose is to make an invasion into the castle very difficult and basically to ward off invaders, right? So that is how the moat is originally is. And Warren Buffett borrowed that term to give you a visual idea that a company must have this kind of like a competitive advantage, right? So another word for moat is competitive advantage, and what it does is to ward off other competitors from capturing the market share that the company has already gathered. Of course, as much as possible grow, right, by enlarging that moat, and you continue to protect the market share that the company has captured. So that is the moat concept. And of course, Warren Buffett make it like very descriptive, it's easy to understand, but to really do it, how do you analyze whether a company have moat? And that's where Morningstar come in. It is a financial data company, and they also provide a lot of financial research on companies, and they created a moat framework, which consists of 5 areas that investors can look at. So for example, there's like intangible assets, which branding will come under it. It can be rights, intellectual property, all these kind of intangible assets. And second can be switching costs. That means it's a lot more harder for a customer to switch to another service provider or product. Okay, there is some characteristics that trap the customer with the vendor, so that's switching costs. And there's network effect, which means that once you have gathered enough users, it's very difficult for another company to come in and steal users from you. So a lot of people think about social media platforms, right? It's not easy to start one from scratch. It can extend to those kind of supply and demand aggregators like Grab, like Uber. Once you have both sides of the users, it's very difficult for anyone to start a new company to compete in the same business. And there's cost advantages, which means that a company is able to produce products and services at a much lower cost compared to other competitors. That would translate to higher profit margins, and also the room for these companies to cut the prices and to kill off the competition. And then there's like efficient scale. It can be because of the distribution network that the company has established, and it's not easy for any company to ramp up to that kind of scale that the business have already gathered. So there are these 5 categories where it can help investors look into whether a business have moat or not. So interestingly, I was very curious to see whether Singapore blue chip companies have that kind of moats. And there are 30 stocks in the STI, and of course Morningstar have also done some research on all these companies. And I looked through the Morningstar database, and I realized that there were 13 stocks in the STI that were labeled to have moats. Okay, so I'm going to review to you what these 13 stocks are. But before I review the 13 companies, I prepared a PDF version of that 13 stocks, which you can download conveniently. The link I'll provide in the description below, so you can just click and you can download the PDF for your own viewing. But in this video, I'm still going to explain to you one by one what these companies are. So start off, we will talk about the biggest component in STI, which are the 3 local banks, DBS, OCBC, and UOB. And this should not come as a surprise because these are the pillars of the Singapore economy. Right? It is a financial hub, and a lot of economic activity involves money and financial activities. And naturally, these 3 companies or these 3 banks will get majority of the business. So let's see what Morningstar say about their moats. Okay, so specifically there were 2 things, right? First is that they talk about the cost advantage, because these 3 banks have managed to amass a lot of the customers or retail savings, right? So it is very likely that any Singaporeans is going to use one of these 3 local banks, if not all 3. And by depositing money in it, the banks don't pay a lot of interest. That's what we have known for a long time, right? 0. I don't know how many percent on a savings account. So which means that the cost of funds for these banks are very low, right? Because they have a huge amount of customer deposit, which they pay very low interest on them. And then they take this money to lend out to other businesses to lend back to the customers in terms of housing loan, car loan, credit card loans. So they pay probably like 0 point something percent, and then yet they make 5%, 10%, 15%, or even up to 24% in terms of credit card charges. So that is why they have these cost advantages. It is unlike a lot of other foreign banks, right, which they may not be able to gather enough customer deposit to bring down the cost of funds for them. And the second thing is switching costs, right? So one example that they give is these three banks have extensive ATM network, right? So when you want to open up a bank account, it is also very normal that you will think about, oh, how am I going to withdraw my money? Is it convenient? It can be a case where you want to use a bank where there isn't ATM available and it is very far away from your workplace or your home. That makes it very inconvenient for you, right? So you will think twice before you open a bank account. So similarly, these three banks have this extensive ATM network. It's very difficult for anyone to just switch out of it and just, oh, I don't like the local banks, I just want to go for a foreign one. So you realize that that can be one of the key considerations for customers. So it becomes sticky and they stick with these three banks. And on top of that, I gave a bit of more thinking, right? What are some of the moats or some of the competitive advantage that can come from? And I think these three local banks have branding and trust, right? Because they have been around for decades and it is very entrenched in terms of the mind share. And that really is very difficult to build up that kind of trust. It's not like a new player that come in and offer a lot of perks. They can move a lot of money away from these three local banks. So I think this branding and trust is a very, very strong mode, which is an intangible asset in this case. And the second is that I also noticed, over the years, the Singapore government will like give maybe some handout, some package to fellow Singaporeans. And usually this distribution of funds is done through the three local banks and not any other foreign banks. So you can see that there is even like, I won't call it favoritism, but established channels, right? Established distribution channel that the government use, and they are using these three banks to do it. And that shows you the relevance of these three banks, right? It's not going to go away anytime soon. Third is that in the early 2000s, there was an opening up of the banking industry in Singapore, right? Allowing foreign banks to set up shop here. And those days, people were worried, right? Are the local banks strong enough to ward off these big names like JP Morgan, Citigroup, which are coming for the Singapore market? And that's why a lot of consolidation happened and these three major banks established themselves. I would say that that fear was unfounded because the three banks just grew very strongly from there, and the foreign banks didn't really capture a big market share in the last 20 years. So you can see that how powerful their moat is in terms of the branding and the trust to ward off all these foreign players. And which also lead to the next point, right? People are talking about digital banks, blah, 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 which I don't think that digital bank is going to be a big threat. Even at this point in time, right? The trust and the established distribution network, as well as the ATM network, as well as all the banking activities are just too hard for customers to switch out of them. So I don't think that the three banks are going to suffer from any major loss of business, even with the digital banking coming in. And lastly, I also see that there are some growth prospect, right? Because Singapore is a wealth hub and a lot of hot money always flows in here, and that is beneficial for the banks, right? And generally, the affluence is also growing in Singapore. So with more wealth, the banks will also have more assets to manage, and foreign inflows, I mentioned about that, and as well as for overseas expansion, right? So in recent years, some of these banks, local banks, have also get a foothold, right, in China, in India, and with Citigroup also exiting some of their Asia business, and UOB, for example, have captured part of it in Taiwan market by buying over Citigroup's operations over there. So you can see that, all in all, I think that these three banks does have a lot of strong moat to talk about. So that's the first three. And the next one is Singtel. Okay, Singtel is the biggest telco, right, in Singapore, and it has 47% of the total subscribers in Singapore mobile market. It's also the most profitable operator, right? So all these are according to the analysis by Morningstar. And not only that, right, it also have enterprise services, right, NCS, which serve enterprise and government customers, and these are again very sticky, right? They don't anyhow switch vendors, especially if they have established working relationship and protocol with Singtel. Is very unlikely to move away. And also because telecommunication is a very key infrastructure asset for any country, right? For example, let's say there's a war broke out, you definitely want to own, the government or the military definitely want to have control over the communication network, and it's not going to allow any private company to like leak out sensitive information, especially military information, to the adversaries. So you see that Singtel will be closely related to government agencies, so there will be a lot of dealings that you and I may not even know. And you also have a network infrastructure, right? It has a fiber network in Singapore, which is via the NetLink Trust. And this, again, infrastructure is not easy to replicate, right? Who in the right mind is going to establish another fiber network in Singapore? It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's not guaranteed that you're going to get customers. So you can see that it does have moat physically, as well as with relationship with the government, as well as the market share and the branding. Okay, but for me, I don't really like Singtel in the sense that the growth is not there, right? Yes, they dominated the market in Singapore, but it's a small market. They tried to venture in India, Australia. They didn't really get a lot of growth from those areas. So I think it is not really a growth stock. And if you look at dividends, it's not particularly high. I think like 3-4% dividend yield. But of course, if you're okay with that kind of level, I would expect Singtel to be very consistent in its dividend distribution, considering that it really have that moat, right, to solidify its leadership position. And I think that it's better to look at a value perspective, right, because it does have important assets, infrastructure. And one of it, I would think that is not unleashed yet is the data centers. Singtel does have a lot of data centers. And if they can spin off to a Singtel data center REIT, I would think that would unlock some value, and it should be quite popular as well, right? Given the Singtel branding, like what they did for the NetLink Trust, right? It did pretty well after the spin-off. Okay, so Singtel, I think, is more of a value unlocking kind of issues. Next, we have ST Engineering, again another very close to the government. A company is very close to the government, okay, because it is a defense contractor. In fact, it is Singapore's main defense contractor. Even like, for example, if they acquire weapon systems from foreign countries, ST Engineering might even be involved to do certain integration, certain modification, or even maintenance servicing packages with the Singapore Armed Forces. You can see that the business is guaranteed, and Singapore has always budgeted a percentage of the GDP to defense spending, because it's one of the key beliefs of the Singapore government. We must be able to defend what we own, right? So as the economy grow, as our wealth grow, we will need better weapon system to protect all the things that we have. So there will be consistent spending, and ST Engineering will definitely be a beneficiary of that. Morningstar also added that there's high switching costs, obviously, right? Who is going to switch another vendor because the other vendor is cheaper? You're talking about national defense, okay? It is very sensitive, and you don't want to be seen as a cheapskate. And someone pop up, you're going to have a lot of issues to handle. So that's why ST Engineering will remain as the main defense contractor to the Singapore government. That's it. Even though we talk about there's defense spending, I don't think the growth is going to be like in the teens or in the 20% kind of level. Maybe a single digit growth, more of like a slow and steady growth, right, in tandem with the defense spending in Singapore. And you can see more like a dividend stock, right? So the dividend can be about 4-5%, right? Slightly higher than Singtel. That's what I would expect. And I think that for that level, it looks more palatable for dividend investors. Okay, next we have a REIT, which is a Capital Land Integrated Commercial Trust. When I look through the several REITs, right, like there are Maple3 REITs in the STI component, but somehow they didn't make the mark to have a moat according to Morningstar. But somehow this CICT did qualify, right? And the explanation is that because together with Capital Land, which is the sponsor, they own around 20% of Grade A office space in the Singapore CBD. So the argument is that in a small city, and CBD space is also very limited. It's very difficult for Singapore to expand that office space, and whatever you have is whatever you're going to get. And by having the largest pool of this Grade A office in the CBD area, it gives you a position to capture whatever office demand there is in Singapore. And they also have the retail side, right? Because this was a merger between the office and the retail malls, okay, into CICT several years ago. And these retail assets, which are the shopping malls, are also very strategically located in very near MRT stations. Basically, their locations are very good, very high human traffic. You can only have like one building integrated with the MRT station. You cannot have like two or three, right? You can link the buildings together, but the one that's really right on top of the MRT station, that is the only one. And that means that the CICT assets are having that very advantageous locations and positions, and that again is not easy to dislodge. So for me, I think the key watch area for CICT, what I don't like is the office exposure. So we've seen that in many countries, especially in the West, the commercial properties are not really doing very well due to all the work from home arrangements. And Singapore is still okay, right? The demand is still high and occupancy rates are still high, but we cannot assume that this can carry on because it seems like the work from home arrangement has sort of like become permanent, even though it's not 100% work from home, but there is enough time, right, that is given to employees, right, to work from home. Especially if people work in grade A office, it is very likely their work can be done at home, except for meeting clients, right? So I would say that that remains a challenging part, right? We will have to see whether the renewals of all these office leases can continue, even for the Singapore office properties. Next up, we have Genting. Okay, so Genting is another familiar name. A lot of locals will know, right? Because it owned one of the only two integrated resort licenses, which is to run the casinos in Singapore. And this Genting owns the one in Sentosa, right? Resort World Sentosa. And it is a key tourist attraction, right? So you will see that, you know, one of the favorite destination that tourists come will go to Resort World Sentosa as one of their itinerary. And Morningstar believe that because there are only two licenses and it's very unlikely that there will be a third or a fourth, that prevents new players from coming in. Okay, so there is a duopoly market and Genting will be one of the two beneficiaries, right? So it is very likely if tourism improves, spending goes up, Genting is going to see the rise in their revenue as well. One thing to note is that I find it quite impressive because for Genting, we know that during COVID lockdown, travel was non-existent. It was really very bad for them. But what they did was that they managed to still give dividends in 2020, in 2021, 2022. They have never stopped giving dividends. And I think that's very commendable. And it was also possible because they have a lot of, they have a very strong balance sheet, which means that they have a lot of cash, they have very low liabilities, right? So that enables them to tap into these savings and then give out the dividends during the toughest years. So it's worth commending about, and I also believe that that's why the moat really exists, and that really shows how profitable the business has been in the past that generate this cash pile that they managed to tide through during the COVID years. After Genting, we have Hong Kong Land, and Hong Kong Land is a property developer cum investment holding company, and according to Morningstar, they like the priced assets. Again, similar to CICT, this Hong Kong Land has a lot of properties right smack in the Hong Kong CBD area, right? And Hong Kong is also a place where you can't really have a lot of properties due to the space constraint. And they also have the MBFC Marina Bay Financial Centre in Singapore. They own part of it. Okay, so you can see that their assets are really those kind of atas, high class kind. But unlike CICT, Hong Kong Land has a bigger problem with office demand, right? Because in Hong Kong, the office demand did not really recover as much as Singapore. On top of that, because they are based in Hong Kong, China, and the poor property sentiment that's going on in China, the bearish sentiment, it has affected Hong Kong Land as well, right? Because Hong Kong Land also developed properties in China. He also bought a big piece of land in Shanghai Bund and going to develop it. So they also have that exposure to China property market, and since it is not doing well, the perception will also affect Hong Kong Land, even though their finances remain very strong. But naturally, investors will tend to avoid this kind of China-related properties company for a while. Next, we have SGX, and this SGX is the most special in this list of stocks with moats because it is the only one with a wide moat rating. So for Morningstar, there's a narrow moat and a wide moat rating, and of course, the wide moat is better competitive advantages, very the stronger one, because just like a castle, right? If you have a wider moat, you can ward off invaders better than if you have a narrow one, because the narrower one can allow invaders to cross it a lot easier. So for SGX, it is the only SDAI component stock with a wide moat rating. And it's not difficult to understand why, because we all know that it is probably the one and only stock exchange in Singapore. But I actually discovered that there are actually other licenses given, just that we don't really know them, and SGX is the one. And because it has network effect, it has enough buyers and sellers on both sides for a lot of transactions to go through. And that applies to the securities market as well as the derivatives market. Okay, so SGX is in a good position. So in Singapore, it's almost very unlikely that there is another exchange is going to compete against SGX. Okay, but that's it. SGX does have regional and international competitors, right, in Hong Kong, in US, because investors today, they can invest overseas, not just necessarily buying Singapore stocks. So that is one of the areas that SGX may have some challenges. And the second challenge is that the listing business in SGX has been dropping. Not many companies are listing, and in fact, there are more companies that they're listing. And it is not solely SGX to blame, because Singapore is a very small market. How many companies do you expect to list on a yearly basis? So I think that is a challenge. And how to combat that is that I also start to see that SGX have working hard to create more products like Singapore Depository Receipts as well as the IH Index products. So all these have underlying investments that are overseas, right? So that will give local investors also a chance to invest overseas without leaving the SGX ecosystem. So that's how they want to grow from there. And I think that is a positive sign. At least they are doing a lot more things compared to just doing nothing at all. And another thing is that the derivative market for SGX has been growing, and that is a key growth driver for the past few years. So that is a promising sign, right? So the derivative market includes like Forex, index futures, and the trading volume has been very encouraging, even more than the regional peers. SGX might find some of the breakthrough in some of the products that they launch, right? So it's almost like a spray, and then you see which one really stick. And so far, they have managed to do it in derivatives. I think REITs market is also another one that's very commendable. So that's SGX for you. And the next 4 companies with Moat is there are Sembcorp, Venture, ThaiBev, and Emperador. And why are they grouped into 4 instead of going through one by one, even though their businesses are very different, right? The reason is because Morningstar did not have a qualitative analysis, right, or basically to describe what their moats are. And they only label them as companies with moats purely based on a quantitative study. That means based on certain mathematical calculation, they determine that this is a moat, but they didn't explain why that the moat exists. So I'm here to give you my take, right? So why these 4 companies may or may not have moat. So the first one is Sembcorp, and Sembcorp mainly is a lot of that power generation assets, power plants, a lot of infrastructure play. And power generation is a very key deliverable for any country, and the government definitely wants to have that reliability, and they want to work with a partner that can really trust, and they will sign long-term contracts. And it's not easy to break into that circle and get the government to switch to you. So I do think that this Sembcorp does have some switching costs over here that they benefit from it. And the second one, Venture, it is an electronics manufacturing company, but seriously, I don't see any moat that exists for this company, because there are many competitors. It's not like they have a particular brand that they own, such that they are the only one that can produce it, and then they can sell boatloads of it. So they don't have that, right? So they are like a third-party vendor that makes products for another company, and that's where I don't think Venture really have a moat over here. The only arguable point is that maybe because they are larger, they have economies of scale, and that could give them some cost advantages. But other than that, I don't think that there is any moat to talk about. The last 2, ThaiBev and Emperador, both are beverages company, right? Both of alcoholic drinks. For Emperador, it's mainly the brandy, which is their key brand, as well as some of the whiskey brands that they own. For ThaiBev, they have their Thai hard liquor as well as certain whiskey brands as well. So there is definitely some intangible assets, right? Because certain drinkers prefer certain brands, and if they happen to own those brands, they will continue to have this customer base. So it can be sticky in that sense. And on top of that, ThaiBev also have non-alcoholic beverages, right? They have they acquired the F&N brand, and which means they own the dairy the sodas, and this F&M brand is quite well established in the Southeast Asia region. Okay, and of course Thai Bev also have their Chang beer, which is one of the top selling beer brands in Southeast Asia as well. So these are the four, and I think that only three we can say that they have some degree of moat. Venture, I don't think so, right? But of course, if you identify any moat, please feel free to put in the comments below for Venture. So to end it off, before you go, remember to go and download this Singapore Blue Chip with Moats. I've compiled a PDF of these companies and with all the description of their moats available for you so that you can refer to them easily. And I hope you learn a great deal about analyzing companies, analyzing businesses from that moat competitive advantage angle. And maybe in the future, right, you can exercise some of this due diligence, exercise some of this analysis. Hope you like this video. Give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.